Welcome to the Housing Ombudsman Service podcast today. I'm Victoria King, one of the Sector Learning and Development Lead here at the Housing Ombudsman Service. And we are here today to talk about our recent special investigation into Hackney Council, which was published in May 2025. Now, our special investigations that we're talking about today, they look beyond an individual complaint. Basically, we're trying to find out if there are any systemic failings within a certain landlord, and then we share the results of that investigation so that landlord can learn and improve. Check out our Demystifying Special Investigations Report podcast from September 2024 for more information on what special investigations are. For now, we're going to be talking about a specific investigation, and I'm joined today by Zoe Miller, Insight and Systemic Manager here at the Housing Ombudsman Service. Zoe, we've done a few podcasts together now.
We have.
For those who are not familiar with us, could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your role here?
Yeah, sure. So, like I say, I'm Zoe. I'm we've got two Insight and Systemic Managers, and we oversee the Insight and Systemic team. So what we mainly do are the systemic investigations, as you've described, and thematic investigations. So that includes our spotlight reports and insight reports.
Thanks, Zoe. So we're here today to talk about Hackney Council and the special investigation. Can you tell us why we investigated Hackney for this special investigation?
Yeah, so we routinely monitor all member landlords' performance. And we look at certain key indicators. And the Hackney special investigation was prompted by concerns from our casework about the landlord's maladministration and severe maladministration rate. It was based on cases we determined between April and October 2023. And then we reviewed cases determined between October 2023 and June 2024. And we found that the trend that we'd identified in the first review of those cases continued through to those additional cases.
Can you tell us a bit more about Hackney Council, sort of where it's based, how it's made up, and what sort of challenges it's faced over the last few years?
Sure, yeah. The Council is a London-based landlord and social housing provider, and it has over 30,000 properties. It's the third most densely populated local authority in England, with over 60% of Hackney residents living in flats or tenements, which is significantly higher than both the London average, which is 40.3%, and England, which is 17.1% average. It has the highest percentage of social rented housing of the 13 inner London boroughs. The census data on rooms, bedrooms and occupancy also suggests there is an issue with availability of suitable accommodation and also with overcrowding. The shortage of suitable properties and the age and the type of its housing stock, along with the challenging financial climate, has created an extremely difficult operating environment for this landlord, I think it's fair to say. And on top of that, the landlord has faced additional challenges in recent years and has been through some considerable changes. In 2016, the council dissolved its arm's length management organisation, Hackney Homes, and resumed management of its housing stock and services. In October 2020, the landlord was victim of a cyber attack, and as a result, most systems that housing services relied upon were unusable. Prior to the cyber attack, the landlord had been in the process of developing its own housing management system, HMS. And the landlord initially decided to continue this project, but in 2023, it discontinued the project in favour of procuring a HMS. And at the time of our investigation, there was no fully integrated system and no date for such a system to be fully operational. There has also been significant leadership and management changes. So in 2023, both the mayor and the CEO resigned. And some of the key events have involved challenging or controversial circumstances for the landlord to navigate. So definitely not a calm or settled period for some time. And we do not underestimate the additional difficulties that this has caused. And finally, the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, investigated the landlord for a data breach associated with the cyber attack. And in July 2024, it reprimanded the landlord for a failure to process personal data in a manner that ensures appropriate security, and also a failure to implement appropriate technical and organisational measures to ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk.
Thanks, Zoe. So we talked a little bit about visiting landlords when conducting these types of investigations in previous podcasts. What prompted you to visit the landlord and some of its residents as part of this specific investigation?
Yeah, thank you. So we met the landlord virtually at the start of the investigation, and they did a presentation to us, and they told us about what they thought some of the issues were and what they were doing or what they proposed to do about it. And after that meeting, we wrote to the landlord as is standard and requested some more information and evidence. And when we were reviewing all that information alongside our casework, we felt that we had a lot more questions than we did answers. And we felt that a site visit would be the most appropriate way to get that information and plug some of those gaps that we needed for the investigation, and also get a general better sense of the landlord's current position. So it was for our benefit, but also because we thought that you can only go so far with back and forth with email and through Teams, and that the landlord probably wasn't able to convey everything to us that they wanted to through those forums. So it felt that going there in person and setting aside 2 complete days to spend with them would be the most efficient and fairest approach. So we visited the landlord for 2 days in May 2024, and she mentioned we met with a variety of landlord staff, so that included frontline complaints and repair staff. And we also held a resident session. And it gave us an opportunity to speak to the landlord about those themes, explore them in more detail, and get that the up-to-date perception and experiences of the staff and the residents, as well as some of the current challenges that remained, as well as progress that made, or progress that was felt to be have been made. And the landlord was really open to the visit, and we really appreciate the time and effort it put into hosting us and making the visit so constructive.
When you started investigating special investigation, you looked at our casework. What did you find in our casework?
Yeah, the casework identified issues with the landlord's response to repairs, to leaks, damp and mould, and complaint handling. And there were also some cross-cutting themes involved. That was knowledge and information management, KIM, policy and procedure, vulnerability, and lack of prioritisation and risk management. One case study stood out because it represented many of the landlord issues in one example. It's a resident with complex mental health conditions, and he had told the landlord he'd been living without electricity, heating, hot water and smoke alarms for several years. And when the landlord surveyor attended, they confirmed the resident was lighting his property with candles because he had no electricity. And in this case, the landlord didn't have full records of the property maintenance. There was no evidence of stock condition survey or tenancy audit. And the landlord also didn't have a vulnerability or an acceptable behaviour policy. And we found severe maladministration with this case. It really highlighted how the landlord's poor KIM in relation to its properties and residents put the resident and the other residents in the block of flats at risk.
Can you tell us a little bit about the landlord's scrutiny and oversight?
Yeah, the Living in Hackney Scrutiny Commission, or the Commission, is responsible for overview and scrutiny of the landlord's housing services. Housing complaint performance is sometimes discussed at the Commission meetings, but the formal detailed scrutiny of the landlord's complaints performance is through its complaints and inquiries annual reports to its scrutiny panel, the panel. We found a disconnect between the oversight and scrutiny of the landlord's performance and its complaints handling. And we understand that because the landlord is a local authority, the structure for its housing services and complaints falls under 2 different committee and panel structures. However, the role of the member responsible for complaints, the MRC, is clear, and we said the landlord should consider how it can ensure learning and accountability through its structure to fulfil the expectations of that MRC role. We have a range of resources to support MRCs available through Centre for Learning, as you know, Victoria. And we found these issues hampered by the landlord's ability to identify, explore, or challenge the data and information in an effective or meaningful way. And it also meant the landlord continued to measure itself against key performance indicators, those KPIs, that lacked meaning and impact for residents because the outputs didn't necessarily produce the outcomes required to address the themes seen in complaints. And in general, we found the internal challenge was at times ineffective and limited at addressing the issues we were seeing in complaints, including decisions about the housing management system, the stock condition, the response to damp and mould, and also the fact there were outdated policy and procedures.
In the report, we make some recommendations for Hackney in relation to scrutiny and oversight. Could you tell us a bit more about those?
Yeah, sure. So we recommended the Ombudsman present the findings of this investigation to the relevant commission and panel meetings. We also recommended the MRC should work with the commission and panel to decide on a suitable mechanism to address the report findings. And this is about the landlord taking responsibility for addressing the issues we found during the investigation and ensuring there is appropriate oversight and scrutiny in place to monitor the response.
Thanks, Zoe. So we've already sort of started talking about knowledge and information management, or KIM. Back in 2023, as you well know, you wrote the report, we produced our knowledge and information management spotlight report, and earlier this year we released the follow-up report to that. You found a theme in relation to KIM. Can you remind us, what does KIM encompass, and what did you find in relation to KIM at Hackney?
Yes, so KIM encompasses how data is created, stored, used, and shared. And good KIM is integral to a landlord's performance, its efficiency, and its effectiveness. And the landlord appeared to have a limited understanding of KIM beyond basic record keeping and data production. We heard about the workaround staff had to use in order to record and share information across multiple spreadsheets. And this was because of the absence of a centralised file sharing platform. In a centralised system, data is entered in one database and should then pull across to other areas as needed. But the landlord's workarounds depend purely on staff manually populating fields across multiple disconnected databases, which is both time-consuming and not intuitive. And working in such a way leaves the landlord's operations vulnerable to human error, and it's ad hoc and decentralised and reduces the quality of the service to residents. And although the landlord saw the majority of its KIM issues as resulting from the cyber attack, we had a different view and felt that they were more accurately described as scrutiny and oversight failings. So the landlord's KIM self-assessment referenced the cyber attack multiple times, but it didn't set out clear plans or milestones to move past the recovery stage. And the landlord seemed unable to separate the cyber attack itself from the breadth and entirety of the KIM issues. Throughout our investigation, the landlord told us about its project to procure and implement a new HMS. However, we felt that until it can acknowledge and address the fundamental KIM issues that we've outlined, the system alone will not be sufficient in addressing those issues that we see in our casework.
Thanks, Zoe. That's a really good summary of what KIM encompasses and what you found in relation to KIM at Hackney. Could you tell us now more about the recommendations we made in relation to KIM at Hackney?
Yeah, we recommended the landlord provide an update on its data set gaps and timeframes and methods to resolve them. The data gaps we asked the landlord to focus on are protected characteristics, additional needs, household composition, and vulnerabilities and reasonable adjustments, because these are all crucial data sets that underpin the safe and effective functioning of a landlord, particularly in relation to those most vulnerable residents. And the lack of knowledge, data and insight relating to its properties and residents is a worrying combination, and we didn't find it was given the priority and focus that it warrants.
onto another spotlight report now, or
Thank you.
attitudes. Any chance to plug them in? Onto our other spotlight report on the attitudes, respects and rights. This one came out in 2024, and we look at vulnerabilities in that report. And you talk about this in the final report. What did you find in relation to this in your investigation into Hackney, and what were your recommendations?
Yes, thanks. So in that attitudes, right and respect spotlight report, we told landlords that a dynamic approach to vulnerabilities is vital, including the need to recognise, adjust and respond to their residents' individual circumstances. We found the landlord doesn't use the term vulnerable. Instead, it calls its policy supporting residents with additional needs to thrive. And this policy says it aims to ensure residents with additional needs receive good quality help and support, and that they're able to access housing services fairly. And the policy sets out the principles underpinning the expectations for landlord staff. It outlines the landlord's response and expectations in relation to a wide range of areas where a resident's additional needs are an important consideration. During our investigation, the landlord was at the start of a significant and transformative piece of work on its approach to vulnerability, and it acknowledged it needed a culture change and a move towards responding, recording and reporting, and for that to become everyone's responsibility. And the landlord's new policy and its commitment to developing and improving its response to vulnerable residents with additional needs is a good start. The landlord has set itself ambitious commitments in this area of work, and it has recognised the importance of training all its staff to achieve its aims. And it was positive to hear knowledgeable staff demonstrate real insight into vulnerability, such as acknowledging how much work is needed to get the landlord where it needs to be. When we asked the landlord how well it knows its vulnerable residents, it was unable to provide that clear picture of its understanding. And whilst it knew it had gaps, its data wasn't accurate or complete. So as well as the KIM recommendations, we also asked the landlord to explain how it will identify residents in need of reasonable adjustments and how it will record and share this information across the service. At the time, it told us that it had a case-by-case approach to reasonable adjustments, but alongside that, you also need that underpinning policy.
Can you tell us about Hackney's prioritisation and their risk management? And again, what did you recommend in the report that they do?
Yeah, so we found a lack of prioritisation and risk management across all the areas we investigated. And this presented as an inability to apply a consistent prioritisation and risk management structure to the strategic priorities. When we started the investigation, the landlord was at the early stage of its housing improvement plan, and it had a variety of action plans across several strands of work, which all contained a high number of actions. And the sheer number of plans and actions created an impression of activity, but didn't translate into an ability to get the basics right consistently. And the lack of structure created an environment where the landlord was constantly firefighting, moving from one issue to another without necessary thought and consideration. It was encouraging the landlord responded positively to the start of an investigation, but we were concerned by how quickly it produced action plans in response to key themes we originally identified. And we were concerned because for an action plan to be effective, it needs to be clear, considered, targeted and achievable. There was a change in approach when the landlord's project team became involved in the housing improvement project. There was more detailed analysis of the causes in order to propose actions and make recommendations. But there was a disconnect between the project team's work and the operational teams, particularly regarding complaints. And we found that themes we initially identified in our review were symptoms, but not causes of repeated failings. And the landlord's overly simplistic focus and response to the initial themes meant it failed to carry out an in-depth analysis of the situation. And the lack of analysis meant it didn't have firm foundations on which to base its response and decision-making. And in the absence of those foundations, the landlord has yet to demonstrate it's on solid footing, meaning it's likely to hamper its progress. So we recommended the landlord review the existing action plans and identify the priority actions that carry the highest risk or have the most impact on residents.
What about their policies and procedures? Were there any recommendations around these?
Yes, the landlord failed to recognise the importance policy can play in establishing the culture of an organisation. And we found the landlord didn't have control of its policies and procedures. It was aware the majority of its policies and procedures were out of date or didn't exist, but there didn't appear to be any significant progress in this area until our investigation started. And the landlord explained to us the reason the policy work hadn't been done was because some of the policies were due for review during the same period as the cyber attack and COVID-19. But we found some policies hadn't been updated since 2014, and the majority didn't include information such as review dates, owner or version control. And when we asked the landlord how it prioritised the reviews, it told us that until recently its approach had been piecemeal, and that it was picking off old policies and reacting to our determinations that identified policy issues. But given the number of policy and procedures that needed writing or updating, we wanted to understand how the landlord would prioritise the sequence. And that was a really important consideration, not only from risk perspective, but also because so many policies and procedures are interrelated. And reviewing and updating policies in isolation can be inefficient and laborious. So we asked the landlord for a list of all the policies and procedures, its review schedule and prioritisation process. And it provided us with a list of over 40 policy and procedures for review and updates, 16 of which were labelled high risk, but it wasn't clear how the risk assessment model had been applied. And when we asked what the biggest challenge was for the policy work, the landlord said the sheer volume and admitted they could not see the wood for the trees. So as part of our recommendations, we asked the landlord to explain how it will prioritise and risk assess this policy work.
So, hot topic of the moment, OAB's law.
Mm-hmm.
It's due to come in later in 2025, and at the moment, the guidance hasn't come out yet, but it's going to be initially looking at damp and mould and emergency repairs. How are Hackney dealing with instances of leaks, repairs, damp and mould? And what recommendations did you make in order for them to sort of improve in this area?
Yeah, so the investigation was prompted by a high rate of maladministration findings in relation to leaks, damp and mould and general repairs. And in August 2024, the regulator of social housing said the landlord had 1,400 open damp and mould cases, which include more than 500 cases that were overdue, and over 600 cases were identified as severe. And our casework provided a real window into how the systemic issues presented in practice and how they affected residents. So in particular, our casework showed repeated issues with underestimating the urgency and risk of a service request, about quality of work, repeat visits for a same issue, missed appointments, and work orders raised or cancelled in error. And we found the landlord's response to our investigation failed to address the basics. We would have expected to see a focus on priority actions that addressed fundamental service requirements and high risk gaps, but instead it appeared to focus on aspirational targets and use data on work orders, satisfaction levels and damp and mould inspections to reassure itself and its elected members and residents that it was making progress to address the issues it faced. And while the data was accurate, the limited selection of indicators raised questions about the landlord's performance on metrics that matter to residents, which itself can create a distorted view of reality and provide misguided reassurance. And the landlord's failure to properly analyse and identify the root cause of its problems also meant it risked making decisions and committing resources without fully understanding whether it really would address those identified issues. During the course of our investigation, the target we heard the most about and saw in the landlord's internal reports and reports to the Commission was about this 5-day inspection schedule for damp and mould cases, inspection target. And this 5-day target is self-imposed and actually below the 14-day target proposed in our law consultation, with the final timescales to be confirmed by the government, as you said. And in December 2023, the landlord reported to the Commission it was achieving its 5-day target, and the average working days to an appointment day was 4.92. So this is a welcome pace in terms of property inspections, but there was no mention of the number of days to complete any work the inspection identified. The evidence from our casework suggested the real issue with its damp and mould response is the time taken to complete the work following the inspection. And this was confirmed by councillors and residents during our engagement. And despite this being highlighted by councillors and by us, the reporting continued to focus on this 5-day inspection target. And in focusing on the inspection rather than the works, the landlord is focusing on an output rather than an outcome, but outcomes are ultimately what matter most to residents. So we recommend the landlord produce a performance reporting framework to ensure that relevant scrutiny again and oversight functions, and that they receive transparent, accurate and insightful information and data, which should include the time taken to complete damp and mould works and satisfaction with those works.
What do we hope that this special investigation and also the published report into the special investigation, what do we hope that will achieve?
Yeah, so the special investigations, like you mentioned at the beginning, they're about identifying whether there's any evidence of systemic failure. And we published the report to help the landlord, but also other landlords with potential learning opportunities to improve their services. So it's all part of our wider work to monitor landlord performance and promote learning from complaints.
And how did Hackney Council respond to the investigation?
Yeah, Hackney fully cooperated with the investigation and provided all the information we requested. And we particularly appreciate the effort they made to support the site visit, as I mentioned. The staff and the residents we met during that visit gave us valuable real-life, real-time examples of how the landlord issues affect their day-to-day experience of working for the landlord and also living in the properties.
So we've done the investigation, the report's now published.
Yeah.
What do we do next? What do we at the Housing Ombudsman Service do? What are our next steps following the investigation?
So after all P49 publications, there's what we call a monitoring period where we meet the landlord to get updates on their progress against those recommendations. And alongside this, we routinely monitor our casework to see whether we can see any initial green shoots of improvement. And it's also that opportunity for the landlord to seek clarification or run anything past us that they may find would be helpful to get our view on.
Thank you so much for your time today, Zoe. And
You're
I
welcome.
just want to give a big shout out to Catherine and Lucianne, who put in so much hard work into this report. So my hat off to you guys. And thank you to all of you who've listened to this podcast. You can find out more about our special investigations and read the Hackney Special Investigation Report and access loads more of our podcasts and resources at the Housing Ombudsman website. That's www.housing-ombudsman.org.uk. And if you're a member landlord of the Housing Ombudsman scheme, you get exclusive access to our Centre for Learning Landlord Hub, details of which you can also find on our website. Thank you everyone for listening, and goodbye.